From religion to wrestling, gumbo to grits, politics to poetry, and all things Southern in between, this is Take on the South. Produced by the Institute for Southern Studies and hosted by the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of South Carolina, Take on the South examines the highs and lows of the American South, examines the truths and fictions of the country's most distinctive region, and picks the brains of some of its most accomplished students. To understand the South, you need to take it on, and that's what we'll be doing. Join us as we take on the South. Today's guest doesn't discount these arguments, but he does add to them in his pioneering book, Aggression and Sufferings, Settler Violence, Native Resistance, and the Coalescence of the Old South. F. Evan Nooe offers us a detailed and extremely thoughtful examination of Native American Southern history in the early 19th century Southeast, and shows with powerful clarity how indigenous Americans of disparate lineages, destabilized by colonial encounters with Europeans, formed new aggregate identities. White settler violence in the South and indigenous resistance facilitated the unification of white Southerners. In short, Southern identity was shaped by generations of white native violence. Our guest is Assistant Professor of History and Historian of the Native American Studies Center at the University of South Carolina, Lancaster. In addition to this award-winning book, he has published numerous journal articles and essays on the U.S. South, Native American history, violence, tourism, and foodways. His work has appeared in Ethnohistory, the Southern Quarterly, the Journal of Tourism History. He is the book editor for H.M. Indian and as a content editor for the Journal of Florida Studies. And he's on the editorial board for the International Journal of Disney Studies. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of Mississippi, his M.A. from Clemson University, and interestingly, he has a B.A. in psychology and a B.A. in history, both from the University of Florida. His book won the 2022 Ann B. and James B. McMillan Prize. And Evan, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to have here. And thank you for that introduction. That makes me sound, very professional.
Well, you are very professional, and you're very versatile too. I mean, I love the fact that you have a psychology background as well as a history background. Before we get into the book, let's explore this a bit. Why did you shift to history after doing psychology?
So I actually started as a psychology major in undergraduate. Both my parents have backgrounds in social work, okay, and it was something I was tangentially familiar with. And I thought I was going to be an architect when I started undergrad, and then I realized all of the calculus courses, and it's a fairly competitive profession, and realized that probably wasn't going to be for me. So I sort of gravitated towards psychology and honestly really enjoyed it. But all of my electives were actually just history classes, sort of over and over and over again, because I was enjoying the subject matter. I had some really great professors while I was an undergraduate. Dr. Julian Pleasance, Dr. Clarissa Confer were fantastic instructors, and they often sort of looked at subject matter that I was interested in: Native American history, Southern history, probably more than anything else. And I guess that sort of got me more hooked. And when I was looking at, career trajectories, graduate school sounded interesting, academia sounded interesting, and I was sort of more invested in history than I was in psychology or going sort of a clinical route at that point in time. So sort of eyeing graduate schools and seeing what the opportunities were out there.
Are you from the South?
I'm from Florida, so there's a bit of an asterisk there. Yeah, I'm one of the few people that is actually born and raised in Florida.
Whereabouts?
So I grew up in sort of a northeast central Florida in Ormond Beach. Okay. It's basically right on the north side of Daytona.
All right.
So that's where I grew up, and it's not a lot of people born in Florida in that area. Neither of my parents were born in Florida, and so it a lot of transplants, always sort of off to the side of the South, so to speak. What I kind of like to tell people now when we look at sort of the transformations of the American South over the last 20 years, that Florida was actually just sort of ahead of the curve. The way that Florida has gone in terms of culture, demographics, residents, much of the South has followed. It's becoming more southern now as much of the South is changing to align with Florida.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I think it's a fair comparison, and I think it's entirely right. I'm just curious before we go any further on the details of your work, which is a fantastic book, by the way. The interest in Disney studies, is that courtesy of your Florida background?
It is not. It's
Okay.
courtesy of my wife. Yeah. So growing up, we weren't far from Disney World. We made sort of the childhood trips. I think I can remember going twice with my parents and my family.
Okay.
I was only, an hour and a half from Walt Disney World.
Okay.
But I didn't really start going regularly until I met my wife at Clemson. After we started dating, she let me know that, oh, I kind of go like every year. I'm
Oh,
like,
really? Okay.
what do you mean you go every year? Like, so that's what we started doing.
All right.
And that was actually, the exposure to it. And then, my sort of developing interest in not just Southern history, but Southern studies.
Yeah.
Kind of piqued interest in different ways in which the Disney theme parks present American culture, particularly the American South. And then I think it was about 2015, 2016, the Disney company redeveloped what was called Downtown Disney into Disney Springs, and they relayered it and expanded it with this whole sort of Florida themed backstory of this 1850 town that developed over a century before it became the shopping center it was today.
Right.
So that gave me an in to justify research trips to Central Florida.
Absolutely ingenious, I have to say.
Yeah, it's worked out well. Yeah.
Very good, very good. All right, so you've written this award-winning book. It's got a lot of very positive attention, and rightly so. For our listeners and viewers who might not be familiar with the broad contours of white expansion, Native American history, and the violence that ensues as a result of that, could you give us just a quick overview? Which nations are we talking about? When are we talking about? Where are we talking about?
So I try and incorporate as much of the American South as I can, but by sort of necessity, it prioritizes a lot of sort of what would be the Eastern South, Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, Florida. And I'm really looking sort of the core of my work is early 19th century U.S. history. It starts off in a little bit more dynamic, diversified American South where there still are French, Spanish, English influences alongside the eventual American Revolution. And then from there, we'll really sort of get into the meat of things, looking at, the 1790s through the 1830s. So while it looks at issues earlier, before there is a United States, while there's still several colonial powers influencing the American South. I mean, Spain is going to still be in there in Florida until 1820. But then we see after even Indian removal in the 1830s and 1840s, the legacy of these events resonate for, I would say even till today. And there are going to be different ways in which Southerners who are now occupying indigenous space across the American South are retelling stories of how that occurred, how they are reconstructing sort of the ideas of the violent expulsion of indigenous peoples from places like the South Carolina upstate or Central Florida or, Alabama and Georgia.
So, and which Native American nations do you focus on in particular?
So the larger groups that I focus on are groups like the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Seminole. So the Seminole are down in Florida, the Creek are in Alabama and Georgia, and then the Cherokee are in first in upstate South Carolina before they're effectively expelled from the state's borders, what becomes the state's borders after the American Revolution, and then their experiences in Georgia, and then what become Western North Carolina.
Okay, and so what authority underwrites white behavior with regard to this? I mean, are we talking about militia, state authority, federal authority?
It is often very messy. That is one of the issues that the United States as a nation really has to figure out in terms of where the authority lies in relationships with indigenous peoples. After the American Revolution, we see the Confederated government and then the constitutional government looking to try and assert sort of a unanimous control or influence between indigenous peoples and the United States as a federal government. But we're going to see states consistently insert themselves into these affairs. And this creates a lot of tension between states like Georgia, Florida, even South Carolina at times, about where the authority lies to interact with indigenous peoples. And we're going to see that indigenous peoples are also at times struggling to really solidify a single voice or a unified voice when addressing either a state or the United States federal government. We see a civil war break out in 1813 among the Muskogee people in central Alabama and western Georgia. And these communities are going to fracture along town lines at times. And this is very much sort of representative of the challenging nature of trying to navigate sort of who has a say, who has the ultimate say, and sort of where these authorities lie. Because at times it can be sort of interpersonal interactions that have a cascade effect that gain state, regional, national attention and become a rallying cry for, demands for the federal government to invade an Indian nation.
So this is a messy, complicated story, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and it's one that kind of winds its way in a lot of different directions. While I do sort of leverage this positioning between sort of settlers and indigenous people, we need to also recognize that indigenous nations across the Southeast aren't necessarily going to all have the same interests. They're not all going to have the same sort of experiences. And even within those indigenous nations, there's not necessarily always going to be unanimity, just like there isn't in the United States
Right.
at any point either. Yeah.
So, because it's messy and so complicated, um, tell me where your book sits in the literature. I mean, a few people have looked at this, but not many. This is not something that attracts a great deal of attention. I suspect because it is so complicated and a bit a bit overwhelming at times.
It can be. In terms of where this sits in the literature and sort of the other histories that have been written on the American South, I'm pretty confident saying there really hasn't been one. It has been discounted and cast aside
Mhm.
pretty regularly. It's really only been within the last 10 years you've seen other areas of the country addressing this sort of trend of settler colonialism is impacting American culture broadly, particularly in New England and pre-revolutionary America. But as it goes for the American South, people have done sort of certainly tribal nation studies. They've done studies of wars. The Second Seminole War gets a lot of attention in terms of books written about it, but nobody's really looked at this in sort of a regional context about how it influences Southern culture and the creation of the Old South. This idea that white Southerners expanding across what becomes sort of antebellum South see common cause with one another. There's certainly a lot of other fantastic and very influential historians who have written work on what binds the white South. And that was something that was inspirational for me in terms of how to frame my work, how to sort of explain the connectivity between sort of white families that are moving across state lines and how they stay together in terms of this sort of cultural affiliation.
Yeah, God, that's interesting because as I was reading your work, I thought this is really clever. What he's doing here is trying to explain the chestnut of Southern history. From whence do we spring, right? And doing it in a way that I don't know if anybody else has done it. It takes a certain courage to do this, and I think you did a fantastic job. Without getting into cause and effect, I'm not so much interested in who starts what. Um, and I don't think that you are either. I think you're interested in the dynamic, right, of how this plays out. So what we have here is you've got settler violence and you've got Native American resistance. Can you tell us how that dynamic evolves? I mean, what happens when white people do, in fact, invade Native American territory? What do Native Americans do?
Yeah, so there's a wide range of responses, but sort of time and time again in my research and what made its way into the book was this story of settlers moving into or just up against indigenous land. Sometimes they wouldn't always cross the border, but sometimes what would happen is they'd move into sort of these buffer zones that was agreed upon where nobody would settle. And people from across the state or outside the state would see, oh, look at this empty, vacant space. that we can now settle on.
How did
And
they know it was empty and vacant? And how did they know what a buffer zone was? Like, there's no
yeah.
signs for this, are there?
So there's not necessarily signs, but there are going to be sort of proclamations. I mean, famously, we have the Proclamation of 1763, in which King George is saying, there's this, imaginary line across the colonies where settlers are supposed to stay on one side and indigenous people are supposed to stay on the other.
They ignored that too.
Well, it gets cleared out in a sense at one point,
Right.
but then there is sort of an apathy about maintaining this separation.
Right.
And in that apathy, you continuously sort of see settlers moving into these spaces. And that happens not just in the colonial period, but then, after the formation of states. This is going to happen routinely in Georgia and cause a lot of conflict. And so, indigenous peoples have avenues. They can certainly go talk to the families and say, you're on Indian land, you need to leave, which, generally doesn't necessarily motivate people to leave.
Right.
They can then contact sort of their sort of governance or leadership, who will then petition maybe the state governor or petition the federal Indian agent. And at times, you even have indigenous communities sort of writing directly to the president saying, these settlers are moving into land that by this treaty we agreed on would not be inhabited. And early in American history, the federal government doesn't necessarily have the resources to really install order in these sort of borderlands between settlers and indigenous people. And oftentimes we see states, particularly in the South after 1800, not necessarily all that invested in, patrolling settlers from encroaching on native territory. I mean, Georgia is going to famously have, almost state-directed efforts to undercut indigenous land sort of within what they see as their state borders. So Georgia is attempting to basically claim authority over all of the land that it sees as the state of Georgia, in spite of federal recognition of indigenous land rights on traditionally indigenous land.
I mean, it's a very spongy kind of geography, isn't it? I mean, this buffer zone and the inability to police, the unwillingness to police it in some instance. But all right, let's say they're in the buffer zone and there's conflict, and all of those avenues that you enumerated have been exhausted, right? What is the last resort for Native Americans?
So often, sort of the last resort is when they have exhausted all of these diplomatic channels that the federal government or is saying they're going to follow through on, and that states are expected to follow through on. Is they often sort of take matters into their own hands. They have been aggrieved, and they have not been provided justice, and they have their own cultures of violence that have certain expectations about what is expected to be done. And one that certainly predates the arrival of colonists in the Americas in the Southeast is this concept of blood revenge. It is a family-based, clan-based expectation of sort of an eye for an eye mentality, that if you have taken one of ours, we will take one of yours. And that can extend at times to captive taking. But when we get into the late 18th century, early 19th century, it often focuses on sort of retaliations of violence. So if an indigenous person is murdered or assaulted, there's going to be an expectation that someone from the other side is going to be held accountable. And generally, the priority is to target the person who inflicted the violence. But in this clan-based, family-based mentality, the person who is sort of held up for reciprocity isn't necessarily always based on the individual who did the wrong thing.
Okay.
So this clan-based blood revenge can become, from colonizers' perspectives, incoherent, and that they are concerned that now any one of theirs could be potentially slain as a result of some rogue settler trespassing on indigenous land, getting into a conflict, and then having retaliation taken against who's ever vulnerable.
So it seems from some colonial settlers' perspective that this is capricious, it's unpredictable, which adds to this kind of instability, right?
It is unpredictable from the colonial's perspective, but oftentimes they are aware of this procedure.
Hmm.
What becomes unpredictable is they don't necessarily know who's going to potentially be put in danger.
Gotcha.
There is an awareness about this expectation for retaliation, and it's not unlike sort of expectations of retaliation for Southern honor.
Aha.
We talk about sort of
Yeah.
honor culture in the American South.
Yeah.
There is sort of similar expectations of reprisal and violence
Yes.
to enact that upon people who have aggrieved sort of your family or your community.
Presumably, Evan, and you talk about this at some length, if these were to remain sort of private affairs or kind of very localized, it would have been a very different story. But that's not what happens, is it? I mean, don't these become extremely public spectacles, courtesy of newspapers?
Yes. So the expanding press in the 1790s and certainly the beginning of the 19th century really offer vehicles to sort of propagate these tales of victimization.
Hmm.
That a settler who gets killed on a federal road that crosses through Alabama becomes regional news, and it can be sensationalized, it can be politicized, and it can be manipulated. Sometimes not necessarily telling the full story of what maybe the federal investigators found out. Oftentimes misrepresenting sort of the outcome. There are a couple instances I came across in which sort of an indigenous individual assaulted or killed a traveling settler, and they were executed by their own.
Hmm.
But that service of justice often sort of gets left out in retellings. So it is again this sort of re-engagement with grievance, this sort of manipulation of the historical events, and this is what becomes not just news in the local newspaper, but sort of by the nature of how printing presses and newspapers operate, you see sort of the same columns reprinted again and again and again and again,
Yeah.
expanding outward from where this occurred. So they really become, in some instances, even national news
Uh-huh.
about what's going on in terms of settler native violence in the American South.
It strikes me that that's kind of critical for this imagined community of grievance, right? It spreads and it populates.
Absolutely.
And then it becomes a point of conversation, and quickly it becomes a point of history, right?
Mhm.
So that's the history that's being written, and people draw on that to justify their own appalling behavior later.
Certainly, just like historians today use newspapers as historical evidence, people in the 19th century who are writing some of these early histories of the state of Tennessee or the state of Florida or the state of Georgia are looking both at the limited primary sources, usually federal documents that they can get their hands on, but they're also looking back at these newspapers.
Yeah.
And these newspapers become sort of unchallenged sources when you write sort of the first history of Tennessee.
What an immensely valuable lesson, especially for sort of budding historians, to kind of engage in this. I'm sure you probably use this in class and say, look,
Yeah.
this history itself is built on very shaky foundations of what's left out, what's included, and then it makes a new history, right?
Absolutely. And sort of every time it seems to get certainly republished or retold in some form, it sort of gains this authenticity of a historical source.
It must be true because it's been repeated.
Yeah,
Right?
people keep citing, not just repeat it, but people keep sort of citing it, even into modern histories of the late 20th century.
Is that right? Do they still make their way
Every
through?
once in a while? Yeah,
that-
there were a couple examples where I came across that this wasn't necessarily the scholar's focus, but you find this in a 19th century chronicle of a southern state, and that sort of doesn't necessarily get dug into, and it gets repeated in more modern scholarship.
Yeah. Powerful lesson there, I think, for historians generally. Let's move on to some of the concrete ways in which these histories and these engagements formed Southern identity. I'm especially interested in the establishment of physical place markers that sort of symbolize this invented history of white suffering. Can you talk about what those are?
Certainly. There are a lot of ways that basically communities are going to commemorate their conquest of the American South.
Yeah.
And this is often going to be anchored to episodes of violence. This becomes a very sort of ingrained story in many different communities, in which they sort of sanctify the ground where some act of violence is believed to have occurred. and it is often focusing on sort of the victimization of settlers who are often described as sort of the first people there, but by the mere fact that they are being
Right,
attacked by
right.
someone else means they're
Yeah,
not the first people there.
absolutely.
So we see some in the late 19th century, but really at the start of the 20th century, this monumentation of the landscape. Um, you know, Probably not coincidentally around the same time that we also see sort of Confederate monuments being installed in southern courthouse squares across the Southeast. We see this wider reflection on a sort of settler colonial past and a settler colonial victimization that has carried through generations, whether in sort of these local histories or just family memories. And so creating these monuments very much are focused on um, highlighting victimhood, highlighting what was lost. And just like those Confederate monuments, they take a very sort of selective, highly edited perspective on the American past. And for South Carolina, we can look pretty locally at what becomes popularly known as the Hampton Massacre Monument. And this is in Greer, South Carolina, in the upstate, where in 1776, the Hampton family moved into an area that was disputed territory at the start of the Cherokee War of 1776, they are attacked. The Hampton family is attacked as the Cherokee are attempting to basically purge incursions of settlers along their borders and on their land. Like many of the Indian wars, they have a pretty successful uh, opening onslaught. They attack the people who are encroaching on their land, the Hampton family being one of them. Several of the members of the family are killed, including women and children. Um, Ultimately, though, South Carolina militia are going to have catastrophic reprisals against the Cherokee, leading to their eventual removal from what becomes the state of South Carolina. But the memory of that Hampton massacre, as it becomes memorialized and mythologized, gets handed down from generation to generation to generation of Hampton men. So much so that by the time Wade Hampton III is running for governor, he is going to use this to connect with the upstate.
Mm.
His family had moved out of the upstate not long after to Charleston, then to Columbia. Um, and it's something that's going to resonate. It's something that he's going to leverage for political gain. And then we see after his death in the 1930s, the United Daughters of the Confederacy are going to embrace sort of this story as a part of a Confederate heritage. They are going to place a monument, a fairly simple stone cairn mortared monument. It's about probably 8 feet tall by maybe 4 or 5 feet wide at its widest. And it's going to have this inscription installed on it, not unlike sort of a gravestone, but it's elevated, embedded into this monument. And it is going to talk about sort of the women and children who were massacred by the Cherokee at this site.
Mm.
But then it's going to list all of the subsequent generation of Hampton men who were not there, were born, some of which born much after this happened, and never actually resided in the area. So we see how this becomes sort of folded in to this multi-generational story of telling the settlement of South Carolina, in this instance, and particularly the upstate, and how they're connecting it sort of with their own Confederate past.
And that monument's still there.
That monument's still there. That monument is on private property.
Mhm.
It is visible from from basically the roadway. It was originally placed, based on the historical record, above the graves of those 1776 Hamptons who were killed
Mm.
at the start of the war. Um, it seems, though, best I can tell, is that the actual gravesite has been lost, and it was probably a product of the widening of the road that was put basically where this marker was. That's now Wade Hampton III Boulevard is the name of this road, and the Hampton Monument got relocated off to the shoulder.
Okay.
So there's, every once in a while, sort of a local historian or a descendant will try and figure out if they can determine where this actual gravesite is.
Right.
But sort of based on newspapers,
Uh-huh.
I can, the historical record indicates it's probably now paved over.
Okay.
But yeah, that monument's still there on private property, but still very much visible from the roadside.
How many monuments are there? Do you know?
Oh, I have no idea. I know there's been work in terms of indexing Confederate monuments. I
Right.
don't think there's been similar work in terms of indexing monuments about um, settler colonial interactions with
I don't
indigenous
think so.
people.
Yeah.
It was actually something that wasn't an original focus of my work. It was something that just sort of kept coming up.
Yeah.
Find these examples. The Hampton Monument certainly a great one in terms of the purposes of my work, but then there's another one in Florida that's a gravesite marker for Jane Johns, somebody who was scalped in 1836 during the Second Seminole War. She actually survives being scalped, and then she's going to live out the rest of her life in Southwest Florida. And then sometime in the 1980s, a
Hmm.
local historical society is going to put a marker on her grave um, that gives her full name, Jane Hall Johns Matthews, and when she's scalped in September of 1836. And at least when I visited it, an anomaly is her grave doesn't have a traditional headstone. The only thing actually marking her grave when I went to visit the site was this sort of 1 foot by 1 foot placard indicating sort of the very sort of racialized violence against her.
Hmm.
Not when
Hmm.
she was born, not when she was not
Hmm.
when she died.
Hmm.
You know.
It's astonishing that you said the 1980s that this
Mhm.
occurred. I think people probably tend to think this. Oh, this must be in the early 20th century, into the 19th century.
Yeah,
1980s?
still very much going on.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And
yeah.
there's even a more recent one installed in 2000 in sort of northern central Alabama,
Huh.
marking a war site from the 1813 Creek War, um, presenting itself as a memorial to an Indian child named Lincoya. Lincoya is going to be an infant who's orphaned in 1813 when Andrew Jackson and the Tennesseans invade Creek territory.
Okay.
Um, Jackson biographers, even in Jackson's own lifetime, begin portraying basically him as this savior of this infant that was found on the battlefield, literally under the body of his killed mother.
Mm.
So Jackson's going to take or adopt, depending upon which language you want to use.
Right.
I probably skew more towards abduct and
Hmm.
enslave
Okay.
this Indian child, bring him back to the Hermitage in Nashville, where he's going to live as sort of a trophy of war.
Hmm.
And he's going to live a short life. He dies in his teens of a respiratory disease, and he's going to be buried at the Hermitage.
Mm.
Um, his grave becomes lost at some point over time, just like the graves of the enslaved at the Hermitage are also unidentified.
Yeah.
But what is really telling is this dichotomy between the lost graves of the enslaved at the Hermitage and then the very well preserved family cemetery at the Hermitage that has all of the burials very well marked, very well documented. Even so much so of I believe there is one black man who was enslaved at the Hermitage who was basically too old to really start anew after the Civil War and stayed on as an assistant for the family and the property. He is buried in the Hermitage cemetery. But again, this adopted son that Jackson biographers sort of often point to is nowhere to be found.
Mm-hmm.
So in northern Alabama, where the child was abducted, a civic group, I think 2000, installed a monument to Lincoya, where it basically reiterates this very sanitized tale of Jackson as this benevolent savior who found this child who reportedly would have been killed by the Cherokee. I'm sorry, killed by the Creek had Jackson not taken him, which certainly isn't true. The Muskogee Nation has openly refuted that was ever going to be the case. Um, but it sort of tells it perpetuates this story of this Jackson as a savior
Right.
of this child who he orphaned.
So monuments are one way to kind of plot this narrative. Place names too, right? Can you talk about place names?
Yeah, so there's some really great work on Native American history across the nation, how so much of the country is named for indigenous people who no longer remain.
Mm-hmm.
Something I found in the Southeast is that there are oftentimes going to be place names that then get attributed to interactions with indigenous people.
Mm.
There's Murder Creek in, I think, Conecuh County, Alabama. It's still named Murder Creek.
Mm.
And another one called the Matanzas River in northeastern Florida. And they often get sort of convoluted retellings about why they have their name in the historical record. Murder Creek is one of these interesting ones where there's sort of local folklore about supposedly why this creek got its name.
Uh-huh.
So there's these stories that basically Creek Indians had supposedly killed a bunch of settlers. And that gets passed down in oral tradition, eventually written into a travel journal,
Yep.
and presumably then sort of becomes well known. And looking at some of the more sort of nuanced, specific historical records of what supposedly happened on this creek is it's a bit more convoluted. It's a bit more sort of integrated in terms of who's involved in murdering who and what happened. And it seems to be that probably the more accurate story, rather than just Indians killing white people along the riverbank, is that there's actually sort of a band of outlaws made up of both indigenous, black, and white people sort of traveling together, robbing people.
Mm.
One of the most, one of the more sort of violent members of this posse is actually sort of a white outlaw of running from prior criminal running from criminal prosecution, I think back in Georgia.
Mm.
So it gets homogenized down. Sort of the black presence, the white presence gets erased, and who it's just Indians killing white travelers. And this is a story that gets retold even after the Creek War concluded in 1814, very much at a time when the Creek are suffering, but still present in Alabama.
Yep.
So it still sort of perpetuates this idea of indigenous people as a threat.
Yeah.
And then over in Florida, you have the Matanzas River, that translated from Spanish means slaughter. And it is named in reference to the destruction of a French Huguenot community by the Spanish in the early sort of colonial days of Florida's history. But I came across an interesting sort of retelling of this tale about where the river gets its name, and that it wasn't the Spanish killing these French colonists, that it was Indians killing these French colonists. And that one's not necessarily as pervasive, but I was still kind of struck when I came across this in a printed sort of 19th century history of the state, and that this was then something presumably retold at a time when white Southerners, particularly across the Southeast, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, are going into Florida to fight the Seminole, who are desperately trying to remain in their homelands after the Indian Removal Act.
Gotcha. You use this anthropological concept of coalescence in your book. Can you tell us what that is and why it's so sort of central to what you're doing?
Certainly. So, traditionally, coalescence is an anthropological model used to understand the unification of indigenous communities, particularly in response to the forces of colonialism. And this is a global process. We see sort of the coalescence of indigenous groups, anywhere there's sort of this settler interaction with indigenous people. We see in the Southeast, this creates some, place-based circumstances, particularly from the 16th through the 18th century, where we see the coalescence, or sort of the unification of some of the major, tribal nations in the South that we recognize. Groups like the Catawba, the Cherokee, the Seminole, the Creek, are all coming together from different disparate groups, certainly with ethnic similarities, place-based, proximity at times, religious similarities as well. And in response to these external pressures, sort of navigating the changing natures of things over a couple hundred years, they become what we know more historically as these, larger coalescent societies.
Okay.
Anthropologists at times differ on whether coalescence creates sort of a product or it's more a reference to just sort of a process. It is often ongoing. Once we have sort of the Cherokee Nation, it doesn't necessarily mean this process of nation building ever stops. just like the United States is still figuring out sort of the process of nation building even today.
Right.
So for me, what it really offered was sort of a methodological approach and then sort of a scholarly approach.
Mm-hmm.
The scholarly approach is probably not going to be as important to general readers for this project, but something I wanted to do with this is demonstrate sort of ways in which we can better integrate Native American history and Southern history. These are two fields as academics that often get compartmentalized. You are either one or the other, and it's detrimental to both. If we are historians of a place, be it the South, we need to be more expansive in looking at who is creating the American South. And so, what I've hoped to be able to do is demonstrate a way to do that for other scholars and to demonstrate why it's important that we do that for other scholars who often will focus on the American South as either black or white.
Mm-hmm.
That was never the case.
Right.
And hopefully, this draws attention to that discrepancy. And then, in terms of laying out my book and laying out my research, there is an inherent violence to coalescence in the American South. And this project really started at looking at sort of manifestations of violence in the 19th century South. And one that was consistently overlooked was violence between white settlers and indigenous people. And by utilizing coalescence, particularly what we consider sort of the generative power of violence, that it is not just destroying things, but it is recreating things. And it is recreating these communities both for indigenous people, certainly to their detriment, but is also recreating white communities as they are dispossessing indigenous peoples off of their land. And this violence, has a cascading effect. It isn't just people who are directly involved in combat or directly involved in this raid along a trading route. It has a radiating impact in its own time, has a cascading impact over time.
Yeah, I have to say, your intervention here is really very welcome because I agree entirely that without this attention to Native American history, Southern history is in fact deeply impoverished. And so you have my enduring thanks for, setting it right. What is next for you?
So my next projects kind of move in a lot of different ways. I have what I might consider sort of a bridge project in the works. I'm working on an edited volume that is tentatively titled "More Than Lost Causes:
Okay,
Settler and Indigenous Memory in the American South."
good.
And me and my co-editor Jeff Washburn down at UT Permian Basin are working with about 10 other scholars who are contributing essays that look at ways in which this settler colonial memory has been portrayed from I think we've got somebody looking all the way back to the 17th century and then certainly up through the late 20th century and into the 21st century. So it's looking like it's going to be a really fantastic project. But then I am making sort of a pivot to what's been a side project for a long time, and that is my work on Disney studies, as if we can sort of call it that at this point, I think. I'm looking at the historic, I'm looking at the presentations of sort of Florida history in touristic spaces.
Hmm.
And Walt Disney World is often front and center of how people are seeing Florida history. And with this creation of the shopping center called Disney Springs at Walt Disney World now, it's really offered sort of a springboard into investigating the ways in which Florida history has been streamlined into this beginning in 1850, when coincidentally the designers or the Imagineers at the Disney Company decided that a good starting point for where this imagined community would begin is from a South Carolina family named the Sinclairs. Travel down to Central Florida and find this idyllic spring to set up a cattle ranch alongside. And then the backstory of Disney Springs sort of expands over the next century from there as it moves from a cattle ranch to a restaurant to expanding citrus groves, a timber company as well. And they utilize distinct Florida architectural styles and then distinct chronological architectural styles to tell this story of the past.
Sounds like a trade book, a commercial book, if you ask me. You might make some money off this.
I think it's got a lot of potential. I'm working with the University Press of Florida. They have a series called Florida in Focus that is
Okay.
very public facing, looking to engage with a wider audience well beyond academia. And I think my series editor there, Andrew Frank, down at Florida State University, is really positioning this series well to be able to do that.
Well, for the moment, it's this book. The book is Aggression and Suffering, Settler Violence, Native Resistance, and the Coalescence of the Old South. The author is Dr. Evan Nooe. Thank you so much for being on Take on the South, and best of luck to you with your Disney project. Hope you come back to tell us about that one.
Love to.
Thanks, Evan.
Thank you.
That was our Take on the South. Let us know yours. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at U of SC South. Take on the South is produced by Matt Simmons of the Institute for Southern Studies. Special thanks to Professor Dave Garner of the University of South Carolina School of Music for composing our music. Tune in next time for another Take on the South.